Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Metropolis Think Tank. I'm Tina Brennan, the Vice President of Marketing at Metropolis, and we're thrilled to have you with us. This is the 7th year for Metropolis's Think Tanks. It's a thought-provoking leadership program that's top firms across North America. We launched the virtual of this program last year, visiting firms from 5 markets from August through December. This year, going to 6 markets, with firms from Atlanta. Today, we are pleased to be hosted by Cooper Carey, who will be discussing how traditional office campuses can become interconnected ecosystems that elevate the around them and spur. The next Tuesdays, we will be hosted by the offices of Gensler and Perkville, discuss purpose and well-being and for the outdoors. The registration will be placed in the chat box, and we hope you can join us. The discussion of today's panel will be taped and available for fan viewing next week on Metropolis's website. Today's panel is CEU accredited, AIA, and IDEC. If you did not receive accreditation you registered, please email to ceu@metropolismag.com. The URL can also be found in chat. We will be using the raised hand or function today. Questions or comments to the moderator panelist. However, you can submit questions anytime using the feature. Please note that you can upvote ones that you would like to see aired, as those will be taken first. Hosting an event requires the support of great firms like Cooper Carey, credible sponsors. We like to thank Growy, designing and engineering water products for bathroom solutions and kitchen fittings. Knoll Textiles, modern perspective, performance textiles. Landscape Forms, design, culture, craft. Material Bank, the largest material marketplace for sampling in the architecture and interior design industry. Mohawk Group, industry leaders in innovative high-performance and worry-free flooring solutions for the built environment. Tucci, life outside is a life well lived. And Wood Art, craft made, luxury outdoor furniture, premier lighting. Today's panel discussion will run approximately an hour and a half, and I would like to introduce today's moderator, Metropolis Editor-in-Chief, Avi Rajagopal. Avi?
Thanks so much, Tina, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our very first Think Tank Thursday of the year. I'm Avi Rajagopal, the Editor-in-Chief of Metropolis. I'm sure all of you have seen the articles in the news about the great flight of folks from large cities to smaller metro areas as well as suburbs. That trend is still settling, but there's no doubt that this year has seen, for many people who have lived all their lives in large cities, have seen the suburbs and smaller communities certainly become very attractive and hold a lot of value for the sort of small scale connected living that they offer. I think on the converse, people who live in suburbs or smaller townships have certainly seen a little bit of a diminishment in their dependence or connection to larger metro areas. And the great workforce experiment of 2020 has certainly shaken up how many people view their future. Places where people chose to live, work, and play were very much determined by transit considerations, by commutes, by considerations around local community. And all of those things are being viewed through different lenses this year. So this is a very interesting time for us to think about a re-densification of America's suburbs, a real push to make suburbs even more thriving, sustainable communities that people want to live in, that people want to work in, and that people want to, invest their time, money, effort, and emotion in. So I'm very happy to have a wonderful group of panelists to talk to us about this topic today. Here with us today are Ann Handlin, who's the Executive Director of Perimeter Community Improvement Districts. Hi, Ann, thank you so much for joining us. We also have Bill Halter, who's a principal of Cooper Carey's Office Workplace Studio. Bill, thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for hosting this discussion. We also have Ellen Dunham-Jones, who is a professor and director of the Urban Design Program at the Georgia Tech School of Architecture. Ellen, it's such a pleasure to have you on today. And Jacob Vallow, who's the head of the Office of Transit-Oriented Development, Real Estate, and Art in Transit at MARTA, which is, of course, the fantastic transit network in the Atlanta area. Jacob, thank you so much for joining us as well. I'd love to start today's conversation with Bill. Bill, the suburban office complex is not what it used to be. I mean, that typology has been changing and transforming over the past decade in many ways. And we've certainly seen the influence of tech culture, startup culture, Silicon Valley culture, work-life balance, all of those things really come into play in suburban offices as much as we've seen them in urban offices. How do those trends now play into this new scenario of 2021? How do you think those trends might continue or might shift or change as we go into the new normal?
Absolutely. Avi, thanks for the introduction and welcome everyone from across America. I'm sure we can all relate to our local suburban communities as they have changed over the years. So yeah, I think absolutely suburbia is transforming. It's certainly been becoming denser. But what we're finding with suburbs is the structure of a suburb is so different than an urban center. So we're having to find ways to really make density happen in really quite different ways than you would if you were building within a more traditional city. Because suburbs really were formed by the advent of the interstate or the big highway systems that then connected out to rural communities. The road network itself is really quite fluid. There really is no street grid. It's really big roads to medium-sized roads to smaller roads that lead to development parcels. Which is quite different than what you saw in an urban center where railroads tended to generate a grid and a much different development pattern. So yeah, I think what's great about that really is that you have these really sort of certainly more availability of landscape because part of this development pattern was a lot of residential and certainly, office, retail, hotels, those kinds of developments, which unfortunately were very much parceled out into bigger plats of land, very much disconnected. So what we're looking to do is really embrace what makes suburbia appealing, which is the sort of availability of land and availability of landscape, and really build upon that. So, and it's really kind of exciting because we're finding it. Part of it, what we need to do is to really make these connections that didn't exist because the parcels were so separated. They were dependent upon automobile connections. So when we look at them, we're really looking to make those connections with architecture and with public space. And the last thing I want to mention is, as we think about suburbia, we have to also consider a very important topic right now, which is the entire idea of equity and inclusion. So as we build these spaces, we really want to focus on creating spaces, in our case, for office workers that are experiential and inviting for a broader base of individuals, really trying to find a much deeper, richer community of people from various backgrounds and experiences. And so when we're designing, we're thinking about what's going to appeal to a much broader group of people so that we can really bring that immense diversity together. Because let's face it, businesses thrive on innovation and creativity, and that's what we're after. We want to build an environment for business that can thrive on innovation. And the more creativity and the more innovation that comes from diversity, the better. So.
Right. I think that's really interesting. I mean, to your point, Bill, the big advantage that suburbia has is space, but also the big handicap that suburbia has is space, right? And so this idea that we want that kind of openness, especially in this day and age, but we also want connection to each other and rebuilding that connection in places that were not maybe that were not designed around this idea of connectivity. And, to your last point around diversity and inclusion, of course, many suburbs in the country, not in the Atlanta area, but certainly in other places, have a history of, being peopled and populated through, systems of, investment or as they call it in Detroit, white flight, and so there's a larger story to that question of diversity and inclusion. And I think, seeing suburbs certainly become more diverse and inclusive it would be fantastic. And that trend has also been kind of ongoing over the past, several years, which is of course a welcome sign. So lots of different things that you've opened up there for us, Bill. I'd love to bring Anne in. And the PCID, the Perimeter Community Improvement Districts that you work on are really a fantastic success story in the Atlanta area. I would love it if you could talk to our audience a little bit about PCID, as a whole and as a concept, and also, how you're seeing those communities really remain attractive and thriving, in a post-pandemic world.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And just as a point of introduction, my name is Ann Hanlon. I'm the Executive Director of the Perimeter Community Improvement Districts. We're a special purpose tax district in, of course, obviously, the suburbs of Northern Atlanta. We're a little bit different in the world of community improvement districts in the state of Georgia. We're a little different in that we are two of these special purpose tax districts under one roof. We exist in two separate counties. So of course, in Georgia, our taxing mechanism is through the local county government. So we represent Fulton County and DeKalb County. So the central perimeter market is a little interesting in that it's bifurcated. We represent two big urban counties, and the dividing line kind of runs right down the middle. The perimeter CIDs, the first of the two CIDs, the Fulton Perimeter CID, started in 1999. So it's over 20 years old now at this point, but it really started as an organization to tackle transportation improvement projects. And what they did not call it then, but it was sort of the beginning of placemaking, installing landscape installations throughout the district, bicycle racks, trash cans, streetscapes, all those things. And over the last 20 years, the Perimeter CID has actually invested over about $20 million in the market, doing some smaller projects and also some larger projects. Like as an example, we're bordered on either side by two major interstates. Georgia 400 runs north and south, and I-285 runs east-west. And the CID has spent a lot of time and money improving access to those two interstates. I'm sure we are similar to, there's probably a lot of folks listening in today who represent various business improvement districts or community improvement districts, and they're different in every state. Here in Georgia, our boards of directors can set the millage rate. So every year we set the millage rate, and that's how we generate our revenue. We are set at 4 mills. So $4 per every $1,000 of assessed property value for each parcel within our district boundaries gets paid to the CID. We've seen a very big upwards trajectory over the last few years. Last year, actually in 2020, was a high watermark for us in terms of revenue, and we generated almost $9 million in revenue from both of the organizations under one roof from that special tax. So within the state of Georgia, we are the largest CID in terms of revenue, just to give you a frame of reference. A little bit about the market. I wanted to kind of touch on what's some of the big corporate partners that are in the market for those of you who may not be familiar with this area. State Farm has a big regional headquarters here that Bill and Jacob, of course, worked on. We'll probably talk about today. Mercedes-Benz brought their North American headquarters to our market from New Jersey a few years ago. Insight Global has just completed a big expansion in our market. IHG, Intercontinental Hotels Group, UPS, Cox Communications. Those are some of the ones. I'm not going to bore you and continue going on and on. We have a huge presence of really good corporate partners that are all all been great partners, all been very progressive, even pre-pandemic. And we worked with them on their telework policies and helping get their employees to work in different modes. Um, we've had great success with that over the years. One last thing I wanted to just mention about sort of the nature of governance in the CID. You know, we're public-private partnership, so we sort of are on the border of public and private. We work a lot with our local governments to try to get transportation improvement projects built or planned. We work a lot on placemaking programs with them. And this may be unique to Georgia, but this business district is fully incorporated. 20 years ago when this organization was first formed, it was all unincorporated county. It was unincorporated Fulton County and DeKalb County. So it was really sort of suburbia back then. You know, in the late 90s, there were no really super strong local governments like minding the shop. And so in the late 90s, there was a kind of an environment that was perfect for the corporate citizens and the big commercial property owners. The ownership of the mall, I neglected to mention, we have a big regional mall, Perimeter Mall, that's really one of our big anchors here. But in the late 90s, the timing was perfect for this business district to be formed. And to really kind of act as a de facto chamber of commerce or convention and visitors bureau, local government, because a lot of those things just were not in place. When you fast forward to now, this market is fully incorporated by 3 cities, 3 local governments, the city of Sandy Springs, the city of Brookhaven, and the city of Dunwoody. So our market, it makes things a little more complicated. You know, we've got 3 city councils, 3 chambers of commerce, 3 convention and visitors bureaus, kind of 3 of everything. And so we really view our role as to try to pull everybody together and to have everyone coordinating their programs, because the rest of the larger Atlanta market still views this as one place, you know, the central perimeter business market.
In many ways, the perimeter community investment districts, the PCIDs that you direct represent the change in suburbs that we were talking about, you know, right at the start of this conversation. You know, this idea of suburbs really starting to look at infrastructure, starting to look at, you know, of course, attracting investment in the form of, you know, corporate partners, but also, you know, really creating those amenities for residents. That's exactly the trend we're talking about, which is really interesting. And, you know, talking about incorporating, I think that's really great as well, because, you know, Ellen, I'm sure, is going to speak about this in a few minutes. But this idea of, you know, the suburbs starting to build their own sort of local participation in their own kind of local government is really important, because it gives those communities voice, and it allows sort of a more equitable and hopefully more sustainable distribution of resources as well, which is fantastic. So, Anne, I mean, you know, thank you so much for taking us through that, because I think that's really important. And also just looking at the kind of corporate partners that you have, you know, I mean, we're really talking about a big workforce coming to these districts every day in a pre-pandemic world. And as you said, you know, you've had to work with all of those companies on their telework policies, you know, getting workers in and out of those campuses as well, which is fantastic. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Jacob, I'd love to bring you in on that. You know, of course, this kind of transit planning is sort of fundamental to the success of communities, especially suburban communities. And you know, there was always a relationship between city and suburb that was kind of, you know, defined through travel, whether it's by car or by public transit, like MARTA. Are you seeing a shift in that relationship between city and suburb, or do you foresee a shift coming? What has been sort of your, you know, guiding philosophy or guiding sort of principles as you're looking at, you know, not just creating those transit connections, but specifically, you know, what you do around, you know, the urban, connecting that to the real estate development, connecting that to art and public space and all of that in the communities. So tell us a little bit about, is there a fundamental shift in that relationship between city and suburb, or is there some kind of guiding philosophy for your work as you think about these communities?
Sure. Appreciate the question. So We do have 4 rail stations, heavy rail stations located in the perimeter area. And, the urban versus suburban, as it's often described, I hate the versus component because I love all my children, if you will, both the urban stations and the suburban ones. And so that, it was mentioned earlier, there's so many unique, distinct characteristics of the neighborhoods and the communities around each of our districts. And, no one station area is the same. And I think our approach in terms of guiding principles to transit-oriented development is to make sure that we are integrated into the community. And we oftentimes look at, what the community might need, whether it's healthcare or food access, affordable housing, and really push the development community through our RFP public procurement process to include those things in the development program. Most recently, we were having a conversation internally about childcare and early learning. Many of our patrons have a difficult time navigating getting their kids to school, particularly in the pandemic, dealing with this, and then hopping on a bus, then hopping on a train, and then going to work, and then reversing that in the afternoon. So we were trying to figure out ways to really bring joy to our patrons and make their lives easier by integrating those types of components. But I will say that certainly from the developer interest, that between urban and suburban, it's still very strong for the Atlanta region. I think that's really a result of the macro trend that's going on right now. I'm not sure if anyone has seen, there was a great article published early in the month, I think on the 1st, by The Atlantic. And they referenced some pretty interesting data points from Zillow, the real estate online search, and as well as U-Haul. And believe it or not, a lot of folks on the coast and in very high dense areas are now searching for, or at least investigating, what the pricing is in more of the Sunbelt markets. So Phoenix, Atlanta were mentioned as 2 of the strongest markets that had the most hits, if you will, that folks were looking at. And the data didn't go deep enough to suggest that it was urban or suburban, but certainly it's very interesting to see some of the patterns that are beginning to form, over the last 12 months. And there was a term that was thrown out, the super commuter. And, basically, whether it's suburban or ex-urban or rural, so long as you have strong internet, capability, that's a pretty interesting, kind of trend as well. So, I started my career at, I was in the private sector for 19 years in various development, real estate development and investment roles. I started my career at Hines, actually developing a project in the central perimeter submarket. And Bill Halter was our architect, actually. So what was interesting about Hines is that Hines came to the central perimeter market for the first time, I believe, in the 1980s, and acquired several farms. I think it was the Spruill farm, if I remember correctly. And at that time, most urban developers in Atlanta thought this developer was crazy. But what Hines had found, and evidenced by Ann's list of corporate partners, is that a lot of the workforce in Atlanta is located around this particular point on the planet, and so there's a lot of interest from corporate customers. And as corporate customers continue to look for opportunities to attract the best and the brightest in the region, I think it's great that we're having this conversation, and I appreciate that the public transit is part of the conversation and is considered an amenity, because I do think it is something that does bring freedom to a lot of people to access more jobs and more opportunities for education and et cetera. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thanks so much, Jacob. the one thing I'll just say, add to that is, of course, public transit is also a great equalizer. So if we're really looking to build diverse communities, we have to look to public transit to, at least supplement in areas that have been, traditionally used to, private transit, modes, cars or whatever. That public transit really does become a priority if we're hoping to build more diverse communities. So just to add that to the long list of things that you brought up, and that we're definitely going to go into a little further. I'm already seeing questions come up that I think from our audience members that connect to those points. Just a moment here. Thank you so much to everyone who's been putting questions into our Q&A. We'll get there. We'll get to those questions in just a few minutes. I see some of you have already caught on to the upvoting idea, but I'll just remind everyone else, if you go in there and you want to add a question, please, by all means do. If you see a question that that's already in there and you want to see it answered, please hit the thumbs up sign below the question and we'll take those questions first. Ellen, I'm gonna come to you. Of course, you have a wonderful body of work around the suburbs, the idea of the American suburb, as well as the changes that it has undergone and should undergo. And you've written books on the topic, and more recently also, and some of those books, of course, have focused on office parks as well. So I'd just love to understand from your point of view, clearly the workplace, whether it's the downtown urban workplace or the suburban office park, is a very important element of the equation of what makes a suburb work, right? And certainly a lot of designers, Bill included, Bill, we're going to come back to you in a minute, are at this point talking to their clients about, in some cases right sizing, in some cases looking to long-term, or short-term changes, in some cases trying to figure out, what, if any, changes have to be made to those working conditions and so on. It seems like we're at a pivotal opportunity here for the suburbs. So, at this point where things have been opened up a little bit and there's maybe more openness to change, what should designers, what should strategists, what should urbanists start to think about as they're looking at suburbs in the wake of COVID-19? And given that your work is so much around sustainability and equity and all of those, I'd love to hear about that as well.
Well, thank you. And it really is a great pleasure to be here. And I always love sharing some of my research. So I'm going to start with opinion and then get a teeny bit into research. I think that a lot of the super commuters, the pandemic refugees from the cities who have been moving into the suburbs, or the Zoom burbs, as some of them are being called, they aren't moving because, they just suddenly decided they hate cities and they really want to mow a lawn and want to be stuck in traffic commuting to work. These are folks who lived and liked an urban lifestyle, but they either just need more space or they don't want to pay high urban rents while the nightlife and cultural amenities are closed. So my prediction is that to retain these folks, the burbs, including the workplaces, need to provide more of those urban amenities like walkability, diversity of all kinds, authenticity, and great outdoor public spaces. And I'd like to illustrate kind of those strategies through lessons from a couple of case studies from my new book. Shameless plug. June Williamson and I just published this last month, came out last month. So lesson number one is from Domain. And the lesson really is just that urbanism is the amenity for office. That was true before the pandemic, and that I believe is absolutely going to continue, but with more square footage per employee. Domain was a 300-acre former IBM R&D campus, 12 miles north of downtown Austin, Texas. The first couple of phases of redevelopment inserted in between the old, wide, auto-oriented streets of the office park, new, well-designed, walkable, mixed-use, mostly with streets with very lively retail at the ground floor, a restaurant row. They rehabbed a little bit of the old Selectric typewriter manufacturing plant, the high tech of its day, into creative office. They built a lot more walkable residential to be able to support all that new nightlife. And then, having established urbanism as the amenity, now they are actually refilling the old office park with a ton of new, mostly large floor plate office, Class A office, attracting Amazon and other top tier tenants. So that would never have gone to it in its previous version. There's about 140 some office parks across the country that I'm aware of that are trying kind of a similar strategy, infilling with urbanism. Now, a second example I want to give is taxi, which is, the lesson on that one is, consider trying to, in pursuit of anti-corporate authenticity and fresh air. Taxi was a taxi distribution parking lot, an auto body repair building, couple of buildings and warehouses in a very industrial area adjacent to downtown Denver. Today, the authenticity of the old buildings, even the old parking lots and shipping containers, have been celebrated, as they've also been updated and infilled with distinctly modern buildings and a whole lot of stormwater, kind of green infrastructure. There are now a mix of buildings with a lot of live work, but every single unit, whether it's residential or commercial, has operable glass garage doors that can completely open up and bring in fresh air. And I think it's both an homage to the site's roots. It was auto body repair, but it's also, I think, a deliberate counter to the hermetically sealed corporate environment of just, glassy towers and a cubicle. In fact, when they broke ground on this project, they lit a cubicle on fire. So it's one of the original kind of creative office examples. The big amenity is a swimming pool made of shipping containers, and the tenant list is creative startups who spark off each other in the very atypical amenities that it provides. I mean, while other office parks have been building housing, almost all studios or one bedrooms, they've built 4-bedroom family housing. They also built some workforce housing where the employers pay about 25% of the rent for their low-wage workers, right, to be able to be right on site and not have to deal with they often have the worst commutes, kind of as we were talking. So, there's a whole range of other projects that I think, in terms of workforce, a lot of mostly retail spaces that are being re-inhabited with some kind of business incubators. Plaza Fiesta is a mall here in Atlanta that has been rethemed as now as an ethnic mall and community center. And one of the junior anchors was subdivided into 140 little small shops that are now all manned, owned, and rented, and supporting mostly Mexican small immigrants running really small businesses. And the owner says he's getting double the rent, but at the same time, he's providing, 140 people a chance to really start a new business. So there's a lot of different strategies, I think, for really improving the workplace in suburbia. My takeaways for designers are, one, really create urbanism. Those amenities inside the building, especially in a post-COVID era, simply aren't as attractive as the amenities that are really shared and much larger. So get outside and preserve authenticity wherever you find it, even if that's real, if it's buildings that are screaming 1980s. I think I know the designers in a Metropolis audience can find ways to celebrate that.
What are you talking about? My generation loves the 80s. I mean, the 80s aesthetic is like,
that's what I'm saying
now.
So, exactly. We've seen a lot of creative warehouse conversions. It's time for the creative 1980s office conversions.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Ellen. I think that was a great quote. Sorry, Jacob, you were coming in.
Yeah, I think you hit on so many things that have sparked several conversations in my brain. One of them is the push and pull between authenticity and creating a creative space, right? Because um, I have lived in artist lofts pretty much my entire adult life, and with folks that have rubbed two pennies together to pay rent, and there's a certain level of creativity that comes out of not having a lot, and then to export that to an area that is funded by a multi-billion-dollar corporation and maintaining authenticity, to me, is a bit of a challenge. But anyway, so I think it's fascinating, and there was a conversation that Anne and Bill and I had, I guess, a year or so ago about really a food hall, because in urban Atlanta, a food hall shows up, but it doesn't really get into the exurbs until 5 years later. And we started to think about, well, is there this lag period that can be measured? When does a mural show up in town, and how long does it take to get to a suburb? And then Bill asked me a hilarious question, which was, it is graffiti count for that. And but I think it's a fascinating conversation, and I think you're definitely onto something in terms of the amenities. Even for I'm in my mid 40s and we still live in town, but if the same amenities were there, and the culture and the open space and the event space for arts and music and all of those things exist in the suburbs, it's a really strong pull, I think. And particularly in the pandemic, with sort of the wide open spaces comments. So anyhow,
Absolutely.
One of the things, the trends we've seen is, in just the inclusion of, whether you call it a town green or you just call it a small programmed park. It might be 1 acre, maybe up to 3, no bigger than that. But I mean, in the suburbs, it's not really that most people don't need access to a whole lot more leafy trees and green. It's not the situation of, I live in the middle of Manhattan and I want to get into Central Park to see trees. In the suburbs, what people really want to see are other people. And it's, so that the role of these gathering spaces that are highly programmed is, I think, extremely important. And in many cases is also being done quite deliberately to combat the loneliness epidemic.
Right.
So I have to jump in on the question of office, Avi, if that's okay, because Ellen's spot on. I mean, I think developers know and not so much even, developers know it because the user knows it, the corporations know it, because to recruit the talent today, you got to put them in a place where they can feel a complete buzz of, activity, and they want to be in a place where they can see other people, not just the people that work in their organization. They want to mix it up in a setting that will, again, back to what we're talking about here. We're talking about driving innovation and enterprise success. I mean that may sound totally capitalistic, but the reality is you do that by bringing as many creatives together, whether they're part of your organization or not, and you mix them up, and you get the vibe like Jacob was talking about. So, I mean, specifically, State Farm, we built an urban plaza. And it's a urban plaza, which the thousands of people that will one day occupy those buildings, thank you, pandemic, will mix it up with the people of Dunwoody and Sandy Springs. And it was very intentional. And just back to your point, Jacob, about street art, I was thrilled to see we have these huge structures that kind of divert an urban stream at State Farm. And I was out there, I don't know, probably maybe a year ago. They were still building the building. Somebody had already done a huge urban mural, which I think you would probably call graffiti, in that culvert. I don't know if you've seen it, Anne, but it made me happy. It was like all of a sudden this place is getting a little gritty. And have you seen it, Anne?
I have. It's impressive. The culverts are enormous.
Well, I actually saw a marketing package from a developer that described their project as authentically gritty.
What a world we live
Nice.
in.
Nice.
I just want to point out Ellen, one of the architects for the domain, is actually on the Zoom call today and says, I was one of the design architects for phase 1 regarding authenticity. The 100-year oaks were key.
Oh, I couldn't
We're
agree
going to
more.
start taking, and
Those
you know,
are
and I mean, that's the thing.
preserving-
If it's not
preserving
if it's not the man-made environment, there's a natural landscape. Yeah, sorry, go ahead,
Yeah.
Ella.
They preserved some amazing, wonderful live oaks that the street then curves around. So you also, as you're walking down the street, it really is the terminating vista. It's a tremendous canopy and they put seating under it. Wonderful job.
We're going to start taking our questions from our audience today. We have a lot of questions here, so we're going to get through them all. A quick thank you again to Cooper Carey for hosting today's discussion. It's already been amazing. And thank you so much to our sponsors, Growy, Noel Textiles, Landscape Forms, Material Bank, Mohawk, Tucci, and Woodard Craftmade for supporting today's discussion. It wouldn't be possible without them. For our audience, as we're starting to answer questions, we have one more poll question coming up on your screen. If you can take a second to respond, we'd really appreciate it. But while folks are answering that, we're going to go to our audience here. And we have a question from Katrina Robles. She says, the age-old issue with suburbanization is the detrimental effects on the environment due to sprawl and lawn washing and of native and important ecosystems. Can you talk about planning strategies to avoid making the same mistakes this country made post-World War II? So we just ended by talking about 100-year-old oaks. So that's a perfect transition. Can we talk about natural landscape? You know, all of you had something to say about that in your comments. You know, Anne, you spoke about green space. Bill, you did. Ellen, you did. Jacob, of course, you did. So let's just talk a little bit about sort of that ecological rethinking of the suburb as well. And is that something that any of you is thinking about?
I'll just jump in and say, you know, daylight the culverts. I mean, it's when you look at a map of any city that and then its suburban areas, pre-development and then kind of post-suburbanization, the creeks disappear. They were just, we culverted everything, and I think the number one things we need to be doing, sort of 1 and 2, they're probably in a tie, but is preserving our tree canopy and planting more, and daylighting as many as many of those creeks as we can. I think actually what's pretty, we've made over the last 10 years, well, 2007, EPA changed a lot of the requirements for stormwater and how you have to, and so we've become really good actually at using green infrastructure now to manage so much more of our stormwater. So it's actually one of the areas that I think we've made tremendous progress in, and it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful when well done.
I agree with Ellen. I think that's I think that we have a hashtag daylight the culverts. I like it.
Yeah, I agree. You know, one of the things we did do, which we had an urban stream that was pretty much invisible to anybody. And thank goodness that the city of Dunwoody leadership, and I knew you were part of this, said, look, we want to put a multi-purpose trail next to the building. This was out at the Park Center State Farm campus. And so that was an existing stream that no one recognized or even knew it was there. And it was really an amenity that we saw. We saw this thing may look like some, you know, scrappy, you know, waterway, but in fact, it's a really beautiful thing. And I'm in favor of now the community embracing it and saying, much like I live over near Peachtree Creek, which is one of our urban streams in Atlanta, and we've got a lot of people that take care of those creeks. So I think it's a community outreach opportunity as well. But I'm with you. I mean, we did some work at Georgia Tech where we completely did exactly what you said, opened up what were, you know, culverted, piped water systems that hadn't been open to the sky in, you know, decades. And they're beautiful. They're really beautiful.
I think we should bring the farms back. I think that
Squirrel Farm.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something cool.
It's too late.
Familiar with Soho farmhouse outside of London. I mean, it's a really remarkable thing to see, modern, cool looking buildings sitting in the middle of a field with dirt roads. But, I think there's something very cool about that.
Yeah.
And, there's a large project just south of Atlanta that was a former Army base. And, one of the thoughts was to do something similar to that. And as opposed to doing really high density development, just really invert the formula and lean into the green space and actually don't put down asphalt paving with oil in it, rather use another material. So would love to see those types of things integrated in developments going forward.
The only other last thing I'll just add, when we think about sort of the natural space, I think education is a big part of it. Part of the challenge with the suburbs, this one in particular, it developed so quickly. I did not live here in the late 90s, but it seemed like there was just a mad rush to develop everything, and so much was lost during that time. Farmhouses, people's property, and a lot of what we have now incorporated at the CID into our programming is education on what used to be here. Hey, Joe, corporate worker, if you're working at Cox in an office tower, did you know what used to be here? In 2019, so prior to COVID, we actually, in October, we did like a Halloween thing where we did a ghost tour. There's a cemetery, the Spruill family. We keep talking about the Spruills. That was the big family that owned a lot of the property here. There's a small cemetery, no joke, behind the rooms to go.
I know it well.
Yeah. I mean, there's no markers. Yeah. It's fenced off. There's no markers that are still visible, but there's some signage there. So we did a ghost tour for all of the employees that are in our network. And we got people to come out. We got office workers who came out in the middle of a beautiful October afternoon to walk down there and learn about the history. So part of it, I think, is unearthing these. We don't have a lot of authenticity, but as we begin to unearth some of these things and educate people and talk about it, it's providing the authenticity that I think we're all hungry for, because it is here. It's just kind of buried under this wave of development that happened.
And there actually, though, there are some examples where the authenticity now is what's there. And some of it is a little dated. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of, so, I mean, literally the parking lots at Taxi, they still have the striping, but then they have reed beds and all sorts of other stuff. But you still see the striping of the old parking lot. I mean, it's just the way they make recycling so visible. And it's out of, it's not the stuff from 100 years ago. It's the stuff of the last, 30, 40 years.
That's a great point, Ellen. I think, we overlook the recent history, which in some respects isn't all that recent anymore. It's 40, 50-year-old history that reaches back to the 70s and 80s that has historical meaning and significance to the community. And I think as designers, this gets back to the authenticity and creating the things that Jacob was describing, which is, the artist's law. And I think this idea of trying to bring not only the people that represent a different level of income together with the community aspect of historical elements that give it that grit. So, because I think one of the greatest critiques of suburbia is it's just too shiny and bright sometimes. And I think even some of the attempts to create town centers, and I almost hate the term anymore, or main streets, they're just too predictable. And I think as designers, to find those little elements, and I think, again, back to the developers that we've been working with, they get it. I mean, they really do get it. I think they know that that's the kind of thing that's going to draw the tenant interest. One other thing I was going to say about suburbs, and I don't know if this is, I think it makes sense, is I love the Zoomberg term. I think there's going to be this other thing about these kind of satellite cities that corporations are going to see as places for other office put down points, because we're starting to think of it now as instead of it being a headquarters, it's really more of a cultural hub that we need to create, where people need to get together and work together, but they don't need to all be in one spot. So if you can start to think of these suburbs that are out in the districts where people tend to live, in addition to the downtown locations, as other places people can go to, these cultural hubs, And I think you're getting even more interest in, more, any individual company might have more locations, and they would tend to be in those areas out further from town.
Right. We're gonna, to that point, Phil, we have a next question here from Jeremy Knoll that says, many US suburbs like Ferguson, St. Louis exist because of white flight in the 1940s and 60s. As cities expand to incorporate former suburbs and suburbs seek new ways to modernize and densify, it seems there are some fundamental racial scars that are far from healed. How can design address racial intolerance, friction, and tension as we imagine the renewal of suburban spaces? How do we create spaces? You talked about, bringing together people from different income groups just now. Certainly, when we're talking about that recent history, we have to understand, also that, we have to be honest in our reckoning with history, and that's part of authenticity as well. So I wonder if anybody has any thoughts on that in terms of, cities themselves are struggling with this, but for a while, we did pursue policies, through economic means of encouraging, middle-class white families to move to the suburbs and settle there, while leaving behind the neighborhoods that they once knew. And I mentioned Detroit because, in Detroit, even now, there's families who live in the suburbs, but know their grandparents had a house in a certain part of Detroit, and they talk about it, and they feel a connection to that city neighborhood, even though they now live in the suburbs. So it's just really interesting that, those connections form around, this time of racial tension. So I'd just love to hear any thoughts on that in terms of, how do we face some of that today?
Yeah, I don't have the answers, certainly, to all of that, but I do think it's also really important to recognize how much suburbia has changed since then. Since 2005, more Americans in poverty have been living in suburbs than living in the cities. More immigrants for the last 30 years have been landing in first-ring suburbs rather than in downtowns. The suburbs have been diversifying enormously, but they're still highly segregated. It's not like everybody's living together. There's this suburb that is white and affluent, and that suburb that might be people of color and less affluent, and then there's the very extremely impoverished suburbs. And so it's really, I don't want to paint the broad, we paint that broad brush and that stereotype of the suburbs, because they're, if you go looking for that stereotype, you can find it, but it's so not really the truth of where we are. If I had a magic wand, if there was the one kind of thing that I could try to do to help, I think, the folks who are, the folks who weren't allowed to move to the suburbs when the suburbs were built, who've now been kind of displaced out of the cities and are in the housing of last resort, those folks tend to be in aging, falling apart suburban garden apartment complexes. And as it's pretty lousy housing, sometimes moldy, unhealthy, but it is affordable housing. And so in our county right here in Atlanta, in Fulton County, we lost 9,000 units between 2008, 2016, just because the roofs caved in. We have not replaced 9,000 units of affordable housing out in the suburbs. I mean, if my magic wand would absolutely focus on preserving the existing garden apartments and connecting them with the elementary schools, with the transit, and really starting there and at the extended stay motels, which are also too often the face of suburban poverty.
Well,
I think this. Oh, go ahead, Jacob.
I was just going to say that the preservation effort is an incredibly important effort, as you mentioned, Ellen, because to create new ground-up affordable housing units takes a very long time, right? And we have a problem now, and it's something that we have a robust development pipeline for new affordable housing units at MARTA, but we found it was necessary to reach out to various capital sources, mostly out of New York, because it's the most sophisticated affordable housing finance, place on the planet, pretty much. And we announced in January we put together a $100 million fund with a commitment from Morgan Stanley to preserve affordable units within a mile of our station. And it was important to us because the work that we're going to do, while they're mixed income housing projects, may have some element of displacement, which is a byproduct of the new work that we're doing. So we wanted to make sure that we took the first step in preserving those existing units to make sure people could stay in their neighborhoods and their homes before we move forward with our new project. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we need more capital, frankly, than the 100 million to combat that.
So I would just say to that point that two things. One is the points that several have made here. Suburbia is rich with affordable housing, but it may be affordable housing that's not in great shape. And I think it's a great idea. We've got a client that I love these 2-3-story walk-ups that were built in the 60s and the 70s, right? That's the affordable housing that I'm thinking of. And this client went in and that was actually able to afford them at the time. He actually did such a good job. And this is the challenge. He's created higher value. And I think that's the issue. So you got to figure out how to leave those in place, make them better, because you've got a diversity of incomes living in the suburban areas, right? They exist, and that's good. What is missing though is how do we bring them together? How do you allow? We talk about this a lot, because we say we're going to create, and this is one example. We talk about the lobby of an office building has completely changed. It's no longer the tomb you walk into with the sarcophagus against the back wall with a person in uniform saying, "Can I help you?" No, they are a place we want people to gather. But the question is, which people? And we're really asking ourselves that question. If you really want this to be a place people can come in, and we really think about it, so how do you, and that's an interior space of perhaps a private building, but really even more importantly, how do you create a plaza, a public plaza that brings people together? That's a great challenge to me to do. How do you, is it bringing in a variety of food choices, ethnic foods, or having street art, or having the programmed spaces that Ella mentioned? I mean, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get everybody to feel welcome in these public spaces, no matter where your walk of life is.
Yeah, it's time for the food hall. Go ahead, Ann.
I completely agree with everything that's been said. The only thing I wanted to add is that, in a place like Atlanta where traffic is so bad, right, and things are so spread out, my belief is always that the great equalizer is transit, really, and the work that Jacob is doing to get more transit into the suburbs and to improve the transit stations that we already have. And it's been interesting, there's been such a change of thought leadership in the last 6 months in Metro Atlanta and a lot of the big suburban counties. I mean, for those of us here locally, we know we've got Democratic leadership now in a lot of the big suburban counties, Gwinnett County, Cobb County, that are typically ones over the last 20 years who've said no to transit. And as suburban communities have always kind of said, no, we don't want that here. And now we have the leaders of those big county commissions talking about that they want transit and they want to put a MARTA question on the next ballot for referendums. That's really exciting because for the suburbs in Metro Atlanta that don't have that great equalizer right now, that they don't have transit access, they don't have a train station, it's clear to me that those communities recognize that they need, and that's what's going to help. That's what's going to improve access to open up those markets so that it can be a lot more equitable than they currently are. In Perimeter, I think we're fortunate. We already have the 4 train stations. So we're already better equipped than most markets, but I really do believe over the next 5 to 10 years that a lot of the big suburban markets around Metro Atlanta that are not currently served are going to say, like, we want transit and we want it now.
That's just so fantastic to hear. All four of you just make me so hopeful for the future. And I love that we can pretty much pick any question and we touch on everything from ecology to transit to work to to economy. It's fabulous. Thank you all so much for the insight so far. We have quite a few questions on the docket, so we're gonna try and get through a few of them now. There's a couple of office related questions, and Bill, I'd love to bounce these to you. Henry Chow, of course, asks, how can suburban campuses be made more attractive to the younger generation who had flocked to companies with offices located in urban areas because of the urban amenity offerings? We spoke about that a little bit, so I'd love to link in a question from Jeff, who says, we're talking about corporate office development at a time when the paradigm might change dramatically. Won't remote working push out many more out of brick and mortars into a much more virtual work world? How much office space will we really need post-COVID? Certainly not as much as we thought we needed pre-COVID. And Bill, you were talking about sort of that kind of network hub, the cultural hub of the headquarters and network of offices. So tell us a little bit about how you're thinking that broader sort of work scenario, which, really was the tension between the suburban office campus and the downtown, headquarters. Sort of, how do you see that ecosystem changing, given all your work post-COVID?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we've been asking that question now for about almost 11, 12 months. I think the first 3 months of the pandemic, I was on the call with every developer friend of mine and fellow architects and anyone that brokers that was thinking about it, and it was an issue of great concern and great unknown. And I think the conclusion is, drum roll, we are going to see. I think what we call the hybrid system. I think you probably already heard this term, but we sort of formed it in our own way of kind of talking about it earlier, where you're going to see a lot of people, and it's hard to say at this point how many, but a percentage of people in any given work environment that have existed 12 months ago are going to choose to stay home and work a couple days a week. And then there's going to be the group that wants to stay and work at the office every day of the week. And then there's going to be, sort of this blending of that. And I think the end result will be that I think office space in general demand may decline, maybe by 10, 20%, if that, because what's working against that is that there's going to be this move towards a more open and looser fitting work environment. So there may be some sort of a averaging out. Maybe it won't exactly be 20%. Maybe it's 10%. But we do think that's going to change. And the other question is, and I always go back to 9/11. Remember, after the big towers went down in New York, and people said, we're never going to build another tall building. We're never going to fly in an airplane again. Well, people forget. And we're all hoping the vaccine will make that happen. But I do think that the hygiene and personal health and wellness, we won't forget. And I do think that's going to continue to be an important factor. And this gets right back to what we've all been talking about. What Ellen talks about is restoring our storm systems back to daylighting our streams and just really taking care of our environment. So these are all sort of mixing together. And I guess the other thing that really is going to play a part in this, I think we can all relate to it, is technology. We've really got, here we are, 5 of us talking remotely. We've been doing this now for a while. We're getting pretty good at it, but we're really going to be now depending on it more and more. So if you are remote working, and I appreciate obvious, primer before we got on this call, make sure you've got your internet connection working properly and blah, blah, blah. It's just true. I mean, we just find ourselves with weak connections or crazy backgrounds or, whatever. Is the home work office now somewhat representative of the bigger enterprise? So, which is a little different than what we've been talking about, but I do think we start to knit all this together, and technology gets to be a big part of it, so that we're able to live, more comfortably where we do, and not have to make that horrible commute that many of us have to take. But then from the enterprise standpoint, what does that mean in terms of how you represent the enterprise? Does the enterprise have to now back you up, give you a better workstation, a better internet connection?
I'd like to piggyback on that because I read Jeff's question as well. And just to add to that, just like in 9/11, yeah, we built plenty of skyscrapers since. I was teaching at MIT in the 90s when the internet was invented. And my good friend, computer geek buddies were all saying, we never need cities anymore. That's it. It's the end. And yet, what happened? The same time as we've spent more and more time online, we saw the resurgence of cities and urbanism. And I think the more time we spend online, the more we crave just being around other people, being in gathering spaces of one kind or another. So I think, yes, we will be working. I do think there will be a lot more work from home, and I'm teaching at a university. Boy, oh boy, I can see the university heads, the math that's going on at my school. But I think that, so I do think it's going to be hybrid as well. But I don't think it just means that some people, yes, will choose to just move out to the furthest, cheapest land possible that has a great view. But I think a lot of people are not going to make that choice because we're humans.
Well, the one thing I always say, and I'll pop this in here real quick, is that we have to work like we're working right now, and we are tired of it. I mean, I am tired of it, and I know it's inefficient and so on. So I do think when we have the other choice back in our work style, in our ability to work as a group, that's what I'm waiting for, because I think when that happens, we will begin to see just how much of our desire to stay home and work changes. And I think that we haven't got that yet. And we'll have to see what that looks like.
Right. A quick question here from Jeremy for Jacob Fallow. I think, Jacob, you talked about, preserving affordable housing around stations, and so obviously you're thinking about the connection between income and ridership or usership of MARTA. Jeremy says, what about transportation and access for low-income residents for places that were built to be car-centric? I just would love to understand, how you're thinking about that question, going to car-centric places where now there may be more low-income people, as Ellen was pointing out, thinking about bringing transit access to those places.
Sure, and I appreciate the question. And, we look at our system, in a very organic way, right? So you have the heavy rail, which are really kind of the arteries. And then we have our bus network, which is, which are really the veins of our system, which do reach, many areas in the suburbs. But there's a big conversation going on right now about the capillaries, which is the via transportations of the world and others that have the ability to offer on-demand service and in specific corridors, not even point to point based on the demand of the user, but actually, providing a service in a corridor that then links up with our service. So I think it's a pretty interesting thing that hopefully over the course of the next, several years, I know LA Metro has been beta testing a bit with VIA. We've been having conversations with them and others, and I'd love to see some innovation and to reach that goal, of reaching everybody. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. I'm going to take a few quick questions here that are really interesting. That are bringing up kind of points that are kind of on the periphery of the conversation we're having that maybe we may not get to in the normal course of conversation. Suzanne Quinn says, can you please discuss design strategies or trends for encouraging active living and play for young people in suburban communities, particularly younger teens? An area of concern is often supporting independent mobility in this age group. Can we talk a little bit about play areas, areas for teens? Is that something you're thinking about, Ellen or Anne?
Go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, we, I don't know about play as much. That's actually a really fantastic question. But for just, general recreation, trails are the number one hot thing that we're working on now. If you would have told me 10 years ago that trails would be so hot for CIDs in Metro Atlanta, I would have never believed it. I think we can all thank the Beltline for now making every suburban market want their own version of the Beltline. right?
That's so true.
It's like the food hall or the
Food hall,
mural.
I'm gonna say the same thing. Yep.
Like we want a Beltline too, you know, and it's really quite funny to listen to like local elected officials talk about but you know, I'm thinking, have you ever been to the Beltline? But anyway, you know, we've got a number of active trail projects underway now that we're designing and we've committed to fund and build. One of them will connect to another business improvement district south of us in Buckhead, along the highway system. So that's probably the most popular thing that we've got going right now. And that's, you know, it really, one thing for us in particular in the perimeter market, just geographically, it's we're an interesting suburb because we've kind of got the business district and then a lot of big sort of affluent residential suburban subdivisions adjacent to our business district. And if you look at a map, there's like a tree buffer. There's just a tree buffer right now. The two were never connected. And so we've made our first trail punch through to cut behind Ravinia, sort of, Jacob. I know you would be familiar with that. Behind Ravinia to punch through to a residential community. So it's for the first time ever, people can actually walk from their house over to the business district. So anyway, that's something we're really excited about.
I would just add to that. I mean, the trails, and I think especially if you can ride a scooter on them, I see a lot of teens on scooters on the Beltline. Skate parks are another big one. I mean, traditionally the malls were absolute teenage. That was where a parent could drop a teenager off and say, "I'll pick you up in 3 hours." And there are very few places in the suburbs now that most parents feel safe doing that. And the malls would love to see the teenagers come back. The teenagers haven't been as interested, and that's actually one of the, you know, they've got other ways of connecting. So, but there's part of the issue is we actually don't have we only have about half as many teenagers in suburbia today as we did in the 1970s, the heydays of the malls. So it varies. There are some communities that have a lot, but they're not the target market.
That's wonderful. Speaking of malls, we have 2 questions here about malls. Ian Solenberger says, how do the panelists feel about retrofitting malls to create these spaces you're referring to? And David Kitchen says, and are there further plans to more urbanize the retail mall? So any of you who wants to jump in on this, have you been thinking about malls at all as part of your thinking about the suburbs?
Yeah, I can.
Well, I know David. Oh, go for it, Ann. Go for it.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I mean, it's actually been an interesting couple of weeks here in Metro Atlanta with the big retail mall scene. We've had one of the big major regional malls, North Point Mall, which is in Alpharetta, which would be further north of us than here in Perimeter. It was given back to the lender. That hit national news. Brookfield out of Chicago gave that one back to their lender in an effort to avoid foreclosure. Yesterday, the day before yesterday, news broke that Town Center Mall, which is in Cobb County, which is a northwest suburb, went into foreclosure. So we've got the 2 proverbial canaries in the coal mine, right? One up in the far north suburb, one in the northwestern suburb, and then a third mall, Gwinnett Place Mall. Fun fact, some scenes from Stranger Things have been filmed there. It's like the 80s. Right. If you watch Stranger Things, that mall has kind of been on the chopping block for years. There's a CID there that they have done massive plans on how they would redevelop it. And the county actually has just acquired that mall. So a third case. So it's something that we think a lot about. Perimeter Mall is actually doing well. It has historically done very well, but we're watching these other big regional malls in Metro Atlanta either go into foreclosure or go back to the lender or be acquired for municipal use. So we're definitely keeping an eye on.
I think it's a very, very important area to keep an eye on. I mean, retail has definitely struggled. I'll give you an example, not just malls, but big box retailers. And I won't mention any names, but we are looking at a national big box retail, and we did an interesting kind of look. And I don't know how, it was not intended to be super scientific. We went on Google Maps, and we just kind of went across the region and looked at them. Their parking lots were like half full in the middle of the day. So what we sort of think may be happening is that people aren't going there. The parking demand isn't as great as they think. People still like to go and shop there, but it's not as much demand. So we're being asked to think about what else can go in those parking lots, and maybe it's housing. And this kind of gets back to the affordability issue. Maybe it's housing in some of these markets where you do have big box retailers, which I find kind of ironic. The very forces that took away our downtowns may now become downtowns again, because they have the pharmacy, the grocery store, the sporting goods store, the auto repair shop, on and on and on, right there. And now you live there. So yes, I think there's a lot of land, a lot of parking lots that you begin to look at and think, what can
Let
you
me
really
jump
do
in.
to make it?
Because I got data on this. This is what I track. I have a database. I track over 2,000 retrofits across the country, the malls in particular. Over 400 proposals to retrofit malls, a surge during the pandemic at the malls. At this point, 70 of them have been substantially rebuilt as mixed-use urban places that often the downtown, that suburb, never had. In another 56 are under construction, another 50 are wannabes, have been announced. About another 200 of the malls have been partially or fully re-inhabited with a more community serving use. Number one is office. Number two is a tie between medical and educational uses. But tons of, a lot of malls have become really fantastic community serving uses by being just a new use. And a few then, the third strategy that I love to see is regreening and having them just depaved, turned into stormwater parks, because we never should have built there in the first place, and reconstructed. So yes, malls, all of these strategies, they're actually happening faster and faster. Just 2 weeks ago, I heard JLL estimated that 80% of what are currently at properties of the 1,000 or so properties currently operating as enclosed shopping malls will go under shortly.
Wow.
Other people have smaller numbers. That's the first that's really gone to 80%. So
I was on a call about a mall in the greater Atlanta region, and someone brought up Amazon Fulfillment Center. And I was like, oh my God, that would be the worst. And
there's 6 of them in Ohio, 6 dead malls to Amazon fulfillment centers in Ohio. We only have 1 dead mall to a fulfillment center now down at Union City.
Oh, there is one. Okay.
Mall.
Yes.
Yeah, not Amazon, but it's still a fulfillment center.
No. We have some questions that I feel like you guys have answered in some form before. Daniel Chin says there's typically huge resistance from suburbs to the expansion of public transit. From urban to suburban areas, they're concerned about crime spreading to suburban enclaves. What is the real issue? Now, of course, Anne has us believing that people will want more, transit connections. But Jacob, is this something that you've faced? Is there a resistance to bringing public transit, light rail in particular, into suburban areas?
Short answer, yes, given that we're short on time, but yeah, I mean, it's multiple reasons. There are racial tension reasons in our region. There are economic reasons. Light rail is very expensive. Heavy rail is even more expensive. And yeah, so it's absolutely all of those variables are part of the dialogue, and makes it more difficult to develop those transit projects.
Another big question as we are closing to the end. David Kitchen says, and I think, Anne, this was in response to your really impressive list of corporate partners in the PCID, asking, why do you believe these corporations chose to locate at the perimeter of Atlanta instead of downtown Atlanta? And I think it's actually a nice question to bring up now, because let's come full circle sort of on the charms of the suburb. Talk a little bit about sort of what made them attractive in the first place, and what is that spirit that we need to kind of hang on to? And if you want to talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. One of the, again, this is not every suburban market in Atlanta, but I think this suburban market in particular in Central Perimeter has always been a good hybrid. Always, where geographically, it truly sits kind of between. In Atlanta, we say like OTP and ITP, right? Inside the perimeter, which is the sort of the ring road around our city. And outside of the perimeter. If you're in Atlanta, people may say, do you live ITP or OTP? where Central Perimeter is actually located just sort of in the middle of that. So we're able to offer sort of the urban amenities that an urban market would have. Transit, we have 4 train stations, lots of good, great restaurants, arts, culture, maybe lacking in sort of the authenticity piece and entertainment piece, but a lot of the amenities that more of an urban market would have. But we also still have sort of the creature comforts of a truly suburban market. Free parking in most places. Most of our big office complexes have free parking. I heard somebody say one time that they could come to Perimeter and still drive their big giant SUV and find a nice big wide parking space that was for free, and that's why they like Perimeter. So we've always been sort of this middle ground, and also geographically we've got fantastic highway access. We are right on 2 major highways. We don't have a great grid system, but we've got a better grid system than a lot of the suburban markets in Atlanta. Housing has tended to be relatively affordable compared to a lot of other markets. We've got great public school systems. All of the things that a chamber of commerce would list as this is why you want to move here. We kind of have all of those. That's why I think you see a lot of these big corporations choosing here, and workforce is so important. I'm glad we talked about affordable housing and workforce housing earlier, because if there's anything that is going to be a challenge for us going forward, it's that. We've had a handful of multi-family apartment residential zoning proposals come before some of our local city councils in the last few years. Like, none of them have passed, none of them. And that's a big issue, for new developments going forward. If you can't get any new apartments built, then the allure of our affordable housing that's kind of been there for the last 20 years is sort of slowly eroding. And I view that as a very big problem.
Obviously that's something that, we need to build is consensus around some of these things that we see very clearly that suburbs need in order to thrive. We have plenty of comments from our audience members about that as well. I'd actually love to close on this last idea. We have a couple of audience members here asking about decision making in suburbs, and I think that's just perfect. A perfect sort of segue from what you just said, Anne, is how do we get communities in suburbs to sort of buy into and to be a part of the process of their communities evolving. And one person here suggested, do we need to change the political structures, not have this sort of have more region-based political entities, and in a way the CID is a little bit like that. I guess let's just talk a little bit about that as our closing question here is, how do we bring people along with these changes? How do we persuade people? How do we offer them incentives? Any thoughts or last comments on that would be great as we close out this conversation.
I'll jump in. Sure. I think number one is a little bit of education and trying to make it more personal. What happens if most community meetings, the people who participate, and I really have so much respect and love for anyone who volunteers to be on a local planning board, because that's a thankless job and giving up a lot of nights. But most of the people who do it are frankly retirees because they have the time. And they are trying to protect their neighborhood so that families that look just like they looked when they moved in 40 years ago can continue to enjoy the neighborhood. And today we are a majority 1 to 2 person households. Yet almost all of our major metros in the US are 75% of the land is zoned exclusively for single family homes. You've got a tremendous mismatch. So often in those community meetings, when you have that chance to sort of ask a planning board member who maybe is a little resistant or someone from an HOA or whatever, just say, do you want your kids to live in this neighborhood? Can they afford to live in this neighborhood? Do they want to live in this neighborhood? And often it's through some of those questions that you do actually start to get a little bit of surprise. I loved it a couple years ago when the Speaker of the House here in Georgia, who keeps a little apartment in downtown just for those nights he has to spend the night in Atlanta. And he said, I can't even get into my unit. My two sons in their 20s, they just can't, they just want to live there. And it was a little like that, ding, you know, generational change and demographics are destiny.
Right, right. Bill, we're not able to hear you for some reason.
I'm sorry, my dog was barking. I turned my mic off for a moment. I don't know how you get the right input for these kinds of conversations. I mean, who you reach out to, because I think Alan's right. I think the people that show up in most of these community, outreach sessions tend to be of certain type, and I think that has its own issues with it. So I'm open to any ideas about how you would better sample what people want. And then it gets right back to who are the people that are living in the community, and it gets back to the diversity of the folks that can live there. And I think that's what we're ultimately seeking out here is how do we, and I'm going to bring it right back to office and workplace, how do we ensure that any enterprise can have a solid invitation to anyone that wants to be a part of that organization that feels welcome? And part of that is the place in which this enterprise does business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, honestly, that in itself sounds like a great driver for change, that enterprises in general want to attract the best talent from no matter, what background they come from. And then they want to ensure that the communities around them are welcoming places for that. So, maybe there is more of a conversation needed between those between the private and public entities, between sort of local decision makers and local businesses who are members of the community themselves as well, after all. Jacob, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of this sort of participatory nature of what we do?
Yeah, I mean, I not anything profound. I mean, other than, many of the other panelists touched on it. Everyone has their own perception of reality. And, I was talking to a developer the other day and he said, no, there's one reality. Just everyone on that side, they don't understand the reality. And I said, well, no, everyone has different perception of reality. And I think the more opportunities to bring together people who have different realities of daily life, I think the more innovation that you'll probably get that's more equitable for everybody. So I definitely encourage bringing people together that wouldn't otherwise be brought together. I think it will result in better solutions. But
right. Well, thank you all so much, Bill, Ellen, Anne, and Jacob, for this amazing discussion today. Thank you to our fantastic audience who's been stuck with us throughout, and the fantastic questions you've raised. I think certainly some of the questions have been thought-provoking for some of our panelists as well, and some new ideas in there. So I really enjoyed that. Thanks again to our sponsors today, Growy, Knoll Textiles, Landscape Forms, Material Bank, Mohawk, Tucci, and Woodard Craftmade for making today's discussion possible. And of course, a giant thank you to Bill and all the folks at Cooper Carry for hosting today's conversation and for bringing this group together. This has truly been wonderful. As Tina said at the start of this conversation, today's discussion has been recorded and will be available for viewing on our website next week. We will also be writing up a sort of report, channeling some of the insights that we've gathered today. That will post a little later in the month, and then you'll also see a print report on this discussion in the pages of Metropolis. So lots of ways for you to keep track of some of the ideas that came up today. This has been absolutely a fantastic start to our year of think tanks. We hope you will join us for future sessions. We meet 3 Thursdays in a month, 6 months this year, and the registration site should be in chat. So please go ahead, register for upcoming think tanks as they come up. Thanks one last time to our fantastic panelists, Ellen, Anne, Jacob, and Bill. Thank you for taking the time today. Thank you for being so open and frank with your opinions, and for frankly giving us a lot of optimism and hope during today's conversation. I know that change can move slowly sometimes, but certainly it seems like we do have a window of opportunity now to have some conversations that maybe would have been considered out of the question or outlandish even a year ago. So thank you all so much for today. I really appreciate it, and have a wonderful evening.